Very much, Victor, and the committee for inviting me to speak at this festival. I really appreciate it. It is quite a great honor and a really interesting format. This is one of my first times presenting on Zoom. I've done many lectures on Zoom, but not a talk like this. So I hope I can share my screen. I'm going to try. Let's see if it works. Are you seeing it? Yes. So this, let me start with, this is the basic catalyst for my presentation on the eras of Godard, and I call it a phenomenological approach. And I'll explain that as I go. So this was a tweet from the American Cinematheque about their recent Godard L'Influenceur series, which seeks to trace his intimidable influence throughout time. Yet they only concentrate on a very short amount of his time, his early films. And that got me asking the questions, why this period? And if only this period, which Godard are they actually referring to? I take it that Godard exists in a multiplicity in terms of his eras. And this paper will point to ways in which delineating these periods, or as I call them, eras, depend on a basic phenomena that I've experienced throughout his work, which I can really only describe as the continual disavowal of his past eras, and as I posit, his past selves. For Godard, in order to move forward, really a repudiation of the past must occur in one form or another, either his own or cinema's. In the sense that these eras present themselves as a continuum, disavowing the past while reflecting on their own possibilities, this phenomenon allows me to characterize Godard's oeuvre as a self-criticizing thinking entity. By this, I don't mean that his work consists as a body unto itself, or a brain unto itself, or a person thinking, but really what I refer to as Stephen Mulhall's idea of film in the condition of philosophy. This depends on films best being understood as themselves reflecting upon aspects of the nature of film in general. Yet I think we can extrapolate on this and say that thinking for Godard realizes in the films themselves the conditions for their own possibility. And these are the conditions of possibility that he continually revamps, revises, rechecks, and indeed repudiates or disavows. And this kind of self-accounting in Godard's oeuvre is what I take to be more or less his consistent position throughout his work. So I propose to elucidate this phenomenon of disavowal via a phenomenological approach. I'm not going to fully explain what this means, but toward this end, I'm going to borrow from what I consider to be Stanley Cavell's approach to criticism. Although many, and perhaps he himself, although he's no longer with us, he himself might not consider his approach as phenomenological, but I do. First, I understand cinema as he does, primarily as a distinctive and immediate experience of a cinematic world, rather than some singular, immutable object to be, at best, deciphered. And second, I understand criticism, or cinematic criticism at least, as the continual attentiveness toward and an accounting for this experience in the here and now. So my idea of Godard's eras then is based both on my reflection upon my immediate experience of the films themselves, but it also has to extend to what Timothy Corrigan calls the commerce of auteurism, especially surrounding Godard's work in the here and now after Godard's death. This also lends credence to the fact that although time may appear as a continuum, eras nonetheless overlap, combine, regress, progress. And I'm not here to map out some kind of qualitative linear trajectory of Godard's career, but I simply want to look for clarifying phenomena, clarifying signs in a few films, which allow me to announce some kind of transition in his work via disavowal. For me, there are two clear structures underpinning this approach to disavowal. First, I find that culturally speaking, the man and the films are experienced as one and the same, especially since the rise of social media. Various cinematic utterances are seemingly ascribed directly to him. I find it really difficult to name another filmmaker, experimental, narrative. It doesn't matter. I find it hard to find another filmmaker whose work is not just positive, but experienced, not just as some kind of intent, but as a direct and original utterance. This phenomenon can perhaps be seen best in the abundance of aphoristic memes attributed not necessarily to his films or even his characters, even though they are spoken by his characters from time to time, but from the man himself. And let me show you again a few examples of this. Photography, sorry. What is your greatest ambition in life? To become immortal and then die. Attributed in lid quotes to Jean-Luc Godard, but really this quote is spoken by Patricia in Breathless. Another example, let's say. Photography is truth and cinema is truth 24 times a second. We've heard this time and time again, attributed, of course, to Godard's mouth, his words, his being, but really it's a line, yes, that he says in voiceover, but a line attributed to one of his characters in Le Petit Soldat. And one more example of this. This is from, there we go. This is from L'Histoire du Cinéma. A film is a girl and a gun. Not necessarily in one of his films, but constantly presented as his unique idea of what cinema is and what cinema can be. So Godard is experienced not just as an auteur, but primarily as his films. So this seems like some kind of travesty of auteurism, a kind of an auteurism run amok. However, we can temper that, I think, because the final example that I gave is actually a quote derived from D.W. Griffith. And this leads me to the second structure that phenomenological structure that I find in his work, that Godard's work can be experienced also as citation. To paraphrase renowned Godard scholar Nicole Brenet, if Godard's work at any point seems original, then we have simply failed as of yet to come across its reference. Perhaps many of you have had this kind of uncanny experience of watching a Godard film and it triggering another film, or vice versa, watching a film and going, oh, that seems to me like a Godard film that I've just watched. Or maybe you hear some kind of profound aphorism in a Godard film that later on you discover originated in another text. This happens for me quite a bit as a Godard scholar, watching and rewatching his films. I constantly am learning and relearning his citations, where his information comes from. And I want to share two defining examples for me of this kind of recognition of quotation. The first comes from Jean Rouche's film Moi un Noir, which was released in '59, just as or just before Godard was shooting A Bout de Souffle. And indeed, this moment in Jean Rouche's film seems to be cited in A Bout de Souffle. What this shows to me is that Godard was always citing from the beginning. We might think that there was some kind of progression from presenting in immediacy to presenting citation later on in his more aphoristic work, but no, from the very beginning, he was the one working in the mode of citation. So this is the first clip from Moi un Noir. Very short clip.
Oh, encore un accident. Il y a toujours des accidents à Trècheville. Mais ça ne fait rien. On est comme des Américains. Pour nous, les voitures ne durent pas plus de 2 mois. C'est pour ça qu'il y a la pagaille. Tiens.
So it seems there was a cut, almost, you might say, a jump cut to an accident. This happens also in Godard's film. And it occurs almost as a kind of an aside, almost a kind of an afterthought, to be honest. So what this shows to me is that Godard was always in the method of citation. The second example or comparison comes from much later on, the film Nouvelle Vague, made in 1990, which I think begins a new era for Godard. It's the first film in which dialogue is almost entirely quotation, even though we might not know that when we're experiencing. As such, the film seems to beg to be read, to be sourced, to be decoded, to be deciphered. However, what struck me was an actual image and not necessarily a quotation or a citation, which seemed to reference Bergman, and specifically Bergman's film Persona. This moment hints at the duality of the self, which is really the plot of both films, Persona and Nouvelle Vague. But it also, when considering the film as a whole, begins that new era in Godard, one which we might refer to as citation as experience, where citation becomes a point unto itself rather than something to be looked up, sourced, deciphered. Rather than a means towards some decipherable end, then citation in this moment in Godard is given over to the immediacy of utterance. Oops, that's not what I meant to do, I'm sorry. There we go. So Godard here references Alain Delon, who's come back as a new character. We see his reflection in a pond, himself doubled. And we are quoted a line from Rimbaud. Je et une autre. Now, in Bergman's film, this image also appears as the character realizes that the other persona is watching her, judging her. And we also see this reflection in a pond. Is this a quote? Is this just a happy coincidence? I don't think so. But can we read this as a direct citation? I think not. We don't necessarily need to decipher it in the immediacy of experience. It becomes part of that experience. Whereas in other films with Godard, this idea of citation really cries out to be sourced, to be understood as source. So these two conflated, I think, phenomena, Godard uttering and Godard citing, as well as the primary meanings they beget, one in the immediacy of viewing and one deferred. These ground my experiences of Godard's disavowal. As it moves from early to late, I find his work wants to either be primarily experienced as utterance or deciphered as citation. Each citation is a link to the past, yet it is often impossible to understand it in the immediacy of experience. Yet to fully decipher implies stopping, analyzing, rewinding, reviewing, researching. This seems to go against the notion of immediate experience. If I contend cinema exists as a distinct and immediate experience rather than an immutable and therefore decipherable object, then the main phenomenon which appears here is therefore intent. Not that we need to or can even decipher Godard's intentional meaning in the immediacy of viewing, but that more or less, depending on what era we're speaking of, we experience his work as intentional, as to be deciphered in the immediate experience. So there's a constant tension between the need to immediately experience and deferred decoding, deferred deciphering. Between the immediate and the deferred, this becomes the experiential criterion demarcating Godard's eras. And I think this is certainly true for Godard's first feature, as it is for his very last. In 1960, surely those who saw the first, quote, first jump cuts ever made in a bout de souffle, and I take that with a grain of salt, of course, they must have felt the same impossible imperative need to decipher their meaning in the immediate wonder of their experience. His later use of multiple screens in the 70s, and then 3D collage, experiments in dissolve, other technological devices up to this day, they're subject to the same wondrous difficulty of being asked to be both experienced and deciphered at once. So these two structures, utterance and citation, underpin Godard's work of disavowal. Throughout his oeuvre lie traces of this disavowal, attempts at films, films abandoned, films lost in the cosmos, films like any other, films returning to zero, films stabbed in the back. That's a King Lear reference. And of course, most recently at Cannes, a trailer of a film that will never exist, Phony War. Each seems at once eager to express meaning, yet becomes disdainful of its own limited ability to do so. And hence this looking forward, disavowing the past, that is a constant tension within Godard's work. And of course, this notion that Godard constantly quotes, questions, breaks down, recombines, and disavows not only his own past, but cinema's as well, is certainly not a new or original idea. I'm certainly taking this from others. All the way back to the 60s, his work was understood as it evolved both politically and aesthetically to move away from genre toward what Peter Willan would eventually demarcate as counter cinema in his Vertov period. But just as films from this period, such as British Sounds or Struggle in Italy, were critical of in each of their own way of his early work, this work now seen as ideologically suspect, so too does his subsequent work become critical of this politically charged era. And for me, the most explicit example is Ici et Ailleurs, shot in 1970, but really finished in 1975. And the film specifically criticizes what are assumed to be easily read political utterances from images collected for a film which was never made. For me, this is a crucial example of Godard's idea of thinking, or of the film's thinking. It's a film which criticizes his own past assumptions about cinema's capacity to be deciphered in the immediacy of experience, while at the same time searching for a new cinematic language to speak this criticism within this immediacy. This new language involves an important intervention from what was at that time his relatively new life partner, Anne-Marie Miéville, whose voiceover in the clip that I'm going to show in a second, in the latter section of the film, adds another layer of era-defining self-criticism. If we can say that perhaps his first wife, Anna Karina, was his cinematic muse, and his second wife, Anne Wyazemski, perhaps his political muse, then Miéville surely must be understood not as a muse at all, but as his best critic. Miéville's voiceover here in response to Godard's images, I think, need no deciphering. Let me show therefore my final clip. So what we have here is a film made up of past images made to be made into a film about Palestine. And Godard's voice comes on and tells us what the images seem to mean. And then Mieville's voice comes over and says, no, here's what you missed. It's the first and maybe the only time that Godard adds another's full-on criticism into his own work.
Dans les ruines de la ville de Karameh, une petite fille du Fatah récite un poème de Mahmoud Darwish. Je résisterai.
Tu devrais parler d'abord du décor et de l'acteur dans ce décor, c'est-à-dire du théâtre. Ce théâtre-là, d'où il vient de 89, de la Révolution française, et du plaisir qu'avaient les conventionnels de 89 à faire des grands gestes et à déclamer en public leurs revendications. Cette petite fille-là fait du théâtre pour la Révolution palestinienne, évidemment. Elle est innocente, mais peut-être cette forme de théâtre l'est moins.
So for me, this is a great example of an immediate impression which criticizes the past through quotation, but also is immediately understood in the time of viewing. This, I don't think we can say for much of Godard's, especially his later work, where the tension becomes much greater. So in conclusion, let me say that as I understand Godard's work to be self-critical, I therefore think of it as a kind of thinking entity. This thinking takes the form of disavowal of the past, the structures of which exist as a tension between the immediate utterance of Godard as film and the delayed need to interpret and decipher and perhaps even source his citation of the past. These structures recombine in various ways throughout his oeuvre, but seem best discovered in what I've referred to as transitional moments and indeed transitional films, only a tiny fraction of which I have addressed today, only a couple really. With Godard's passing, however, I really do think that this time has become necessary to have a final tallying of his cinematic thought and its progression from beginning to end. Thank you very much.